Thank you. Can you hear me? Okay. Yeah, good. Okay, thanks. Yeah, I don't want to spend time responding to Michael now, except to say make two quick points. One is I actually think his understanding of debt in the beginning sounds more like a gold standard than a fiat currency type of understanding of debt, and I think he needs to re-examine his assumptions and his approach because of that. The second is that he's pointed to a lot of problems and some solutions, but I think we need to think about policy formulation as about responding to structural change. And to some extent, I think what I'm going to try and do with my presentation is a link sort of how short-term fiscal stimulus must be linked to structural change. Because I'm presenting, I actually can't see the top of my slide, so I probably won't read the titles. But basically, I'm saying government needs to spend more now, and particularly spend on poor households. And I'm supporting things like a basic income grant, further extension of basic services, putting a lot more money to poor households, and I'll come to that now as part of that, even if it means more debt. And I think what we need to think about is the link between household stability in terms of being able to eat, being able to reproduce itself, and macroeconomic stability in the country. And I think the events of July showed us that we need to really be serious about that. And I think that the approach that basically keeps scaring people about debt and debt repayments and the size of it is not adequately taking into account the other side of stability, which is about social stability and the lives of the poor. So stimulating, I'm going to read because I end up taking much too long if I talk through the slides. So I'm going to, so I'll read, and if I'm reading too fast, just tell me. Stimulating the South African economy to reduce suffering of poor households should be part of a long-term restructuring plan and reverse financialization of the economy. It needs to dismantle the financialized minerals and energy complex. South Africa requires structural transformation because the current system of accumulation exacerbates the problems. There's been deindustrialization since the 1980s of an industrial sector that has lacked diversity and depth, where the sectors that were developed had close linkages to the mining sector. There's been financialization of non-financial corporations and constrained growth and development of the productive sector, increased instability and volatility because of the size and dominance of the financial sector and the role it plays in the economy. We have a highly concentrated economy that extracts rents and destroys value. And so when we're thinking about the rents extracted, where we're getting taxing, the possibility that taxing may crowd out other things that may be productive, we need to bear that in mind. Largest corporations in this very concentrated economy have internationalized, some have relisted, most have cross-listed abroad, while withdrawing or extracting capital to finance their overseas adventures where they do face competition. So the result that we have, and basically I'm saying that there's a high cost of not understanding this nature and structure of the South African economy, and that it needs to be dealt with. The result is low investment, declining levels of productive capital stock, growing unemployment, and more precariousness of employment. Macroeconomic policies, fiscal conservatism, and inflation targeting supports rentiers and financialization and undermines long-term productive investment and employment. It disempowers value creators. Government solution to these economic difficulties is to focus on business and to improve business confidence. They are playing the loser's game related to some confused version of new classical rational expectations theory, where they want to prove that their policies are credible and that will cut expenditure and reduce debt. They offer supply side structural reforms. I should say neoliberal supply side structural reforms. However, given the structural problems and financialization of the economy, the efforts to show credibility exacerbates the structural problems. The proposed structural reforms will reinforce the status quo and possibly make things worse. It further empowers value destroyers. Poor GDP performance and pressure to spend more, given the multitude of risks facing the world: climate change, disasters, social unrest because of hunger and poverty, generally related to inequality, health crisis, pandemics, etc. So government's attempts to appear credible and them putting in place austerity and fiscal consolidation type budgets where they say they're moving towards surpluses, etc., and they're going to reduce credit, end up just making them look not credible because they missed targets, and they've consistently missed targets over the last decade or so. In fact, they misunderstood the growth before the global financial crisis. They kept spending money after the global financial crisis. They called that stimulus even though it wasn't. They expected a fast recovery and it didn't come. And that's where we saw debt to GDP go up. And then they like everybody else with the sovereign debt crisis, decided that they needed to move to fiscal consolidation. And we actually saw then the impact of fiscal consolidation, particularly from 2012, but more so from 2015 onwards. And I've got a few slides. I'll try to talk to these as quickly as possible. And just to say that it shows that South Africa has a serious aggregate demand problem that has to be addressed as part of our structural plan to address structural change and definancialization. These graphs illustrate what was well known around the globe before the pandemic, that government actually has to stimulate the economy. People like Larry Summers were talking about secular stagnation. The Fed and the European Central Bank were telling governments that they need fiscal stimulus because monetary policy couldn't go any further. And so there was this push for deficit spending to stimulate the economy. And with South Africa's aggregate demand problem, we have to address this. The first graph shows that household consumption in South Africa has been over 60% during the past 2 decades. It's a large part of our national income. And we see, I won't talk about the declining investment, etc. If you look on the right, we see that over the last, at least since fiscal consolidation, average GDP per capita growth rates, real growth rates have been negative since then, and it's had that impact on GDP per capita. And also, if we look at the graph below, we see the decline from 2015 onwards in real gross fixed capital formation. Just quickly, this graph shows sort of extension of credit. The black line is loans to households. We see in the period before the global financial crisis, mortgage debt increase and loans to households increase, mortgage annual and a large increase linked to that. You'll notice that after the global financial crisis, a credit extension sort of levels into that kind of area with very close to where it was at the peak. What happens after the global financial crisis, mortgage advances decrease, but other loans and advances, which is a lot of credit card data, so for instance, increases. So we have a situation that you'll see in this next graph is that while households have actually been, since the global financial crisis, working on decreasing their debt to disposable incomes, their debt service costs haven't come down, and we haven't seen an impact on savings. Basically, that shift from mortgage to credit card debt has actually meant that. And so affluent households aren't going to that 60% of GDP that's household debt, that's not going to be stimulated by more credit to affluent households. Basically, government has to spend that money in poor communities so that they can, so that we can actually see growth coming from that area. The bottom graph shows what's happened to credit extension, and I said that credit extension had sort of leveled at a close to a level that it had raised. It's almost 10% above what it was before the global financial crisis, but that total private sector business enterprise investment, which is the black line, sort of increased leading up to the global financial crisis and then decreased back to the level where it was before that increase. And so basically we've got the same level of investment with 10% more credit being extended, and that credit is going towards rentier activities. So monetary availability, this question is, can we take on more debt? And money availability is not a limitation on government expenditure because the central bank is able to provide any required finance. Focus should be on the issues of social desirability of the proposed expenditure and the eventual funding of the expenditure. Focus on debt to GDP and debt service GDP treats the tools to achieve the goals as the objective itself. Whether a budget deficit is deemed to be too high or too low should be judged by reference to the idea that the objective of fiscal and budget policy should be the achievement of a high level of employment and capacity utilization. The budget deficit is too low when there's a significant amount of unemployment and excess capacity, and high unemployment and excess capacity shows that aggregate demand is too low and should be boosted by fiscal policy. The budget deficit is too high when there's substantial overheating of the economy, example, when demand is greater than supply, causing an increasing inflation. However, we have to ensure that this inflation is due to excess demand and not supply bottlenecks and other factors that push up price. So monetary policy should support fiscal policy via the aggregate demand channel. Keynes saw interest rates as affecting aggregate effective demand much more through the income rather than the interest cost channel. Heterodox and post-Keynesian economists see interest rates as distributive, i.e. returns to bondholders. So the higher the interest rate, higher interest rates increases, rentier income and wage shares decrease. Interest rates should be lower not to increase inflation and so deflate the value of sovereign debt, but to reduce the cost of debt and for addressing the inequality effects of private ownership of sovereign debt. My reading or interpretation of recent events is that in the mainstream, QE is starting to be seen as not just for developed countries, but also for developing countries, or at least a shift. And I have a quote from the paper by some people from the BIS below. But the issue of if you have a small share of foreign currency, floating exchange rates, and your inflation is relatively under control, I think there's an increasing feeling, and we've seen this even in some Financial Times articles and stuff, that you can embark on some QE. This quote, I won't read it, I'll let you guys read it from the BIS, but basically it says that the markets didn't really respond too poorly to emerging markets using QE. So the use of QE can offset risk panic selling of domestic currency bonds, and we saw that in last year at the beginning of the pandemic. It can restore liquidity and it can lower interest rates. It can help developing countries avoid austerity, deflation, and stagnation, and support improved social security spendings and programs with structural economic change and possibly reduce financialization. This is my last slide. So also, I think we need to talk about taxes and change the discussion about taxes. Government should tax the rich, the very rich, and the ultra rich. And in South Africa, people in this webinar would be amongst, I think, probably the top 5%. And that shows you how unequal the country is, because the top 0.05% have probably, I don't know, 1,000 times more wealth than we do. I actually need to go back and look at the numbers, but there's some interesting work coming out of Center for Southern Inequality Studies and other places on this. So in a country where less than 5% own 95% of the wealth, and the Gini income is crazy, the share of taxes from the wealthy, corporate and income tax should be higher. There should be an annual wealth tax, financial transactions and returns, capital flows, etc. should be taxed more. There should be unremunerated reserve requirements on short-term inflows and controls on outflows to deal with financial stability and limit contagion, but also as a means to raise capital. Taxation on interest on government bonds held by the private sector, combined with the low interest rates set by the central bank. The e-commerce should be properly taxed. So not there should be corporate tax on e-commerce, not just the current situation where that is collected. There should also be differentiation in taxing productive value-adding manufacturing and different from and rent-related incomes from financial and real estate activity.
Thank you, Seeraj. Your network seems to be breaking. Fortunately, it's at the end of your presentation as opposed to in the middle. I'll just quickly message Seeraj to let him know that we can't hear him anymore. But yeah, Seeraj has covered for us the demand side. Oh, I was just saying that we couldn't hear you, but luckily it was at the end of your presentation, Seeraj, as opposed to in the middle. But I was saying, you know, thank you for highlighting, of course, you know,